Goeienaand, good evening, fellow South Africans and citizens of the world. And you know what? This expropriation without compensation, it's going to absolutely blast the flight of wealthy people out of the country. I can tell you that now, and I can give you a brief and then add a bit of meat to the bone. One of the big problems about this whole thing is that when they expropriate someone's property, that person is still left holding any loans related to that property, even though they no longer own it. It's sick and it's crazy. The government should be taking over those loans. But because, let's say, a farmer no longer has the income, there's no way he can pay that debt because his farm's been taken away from him. So what happens? He goes bankrupt. He goes bankrupt. Now, here is where the sting comes in. Countries around the world that people might be thinking of migrating to are not going to take in someone who's a bankrupt. So anyone who's got property, who's concerned about their land being expropriated, they have this window of time, this opportunity before the banks foreclose on them because their property's been taken away, and they get called before the courts and they're made bankrupt. This is a time when they still have the ability, they probably have some sizable investments and different things, to actually start making the move out of South Africa into countries like Canada, Australia, United Kingdom, US, etc., etc. Because once their properties have been expropriated, as I said, the banks will enforce the repayment of those loans. They won't have the money to pay those loans, and they will be bankrupted. And these countries that would have taken them in the past will look at the status of someone who's a bankrupt. They're not interested in why. They'll say, no, rejected. So, why are we talking about this? Well, let me add a bit of meat to the bone. This is an absolutely appalling example of that boiling frog syndrome. This is what the ANC government are currently doing to the wealthy white population who still have assets like property. The proposed change to the Constitution to allow expropriation without compensation, or EWC, that is set to serve before Parliament in the current sitting, is bound to have a huge impact on banks, the financial system in general, and the economy overall. It will hit the very foundation on which any successful economy is built, that of private property rights. While most people believe that economic debate is the domain for economists to talk about figures, percentages, and ratios and produce incomprehensible graphs, the current debate will quickly prove the reality of how economic principles affect people. We can sum up the impact of the proposed draft constitutional 18th Amendment Bill of 2019 that will legalize EWC in 3 questions. Will anybody keep paying their mortgage bonds if government takes their property without any payment? How can banks enforce payment of a bond if the underlying property is taken? How will it affect people? Now, there's a very interesting question about all this. If the government takes, let's say, a farmer's land away from him because they claim that land was stolen from another group, i.e. the black Africans, and once they have expropriated it, they give it to a bunch of their cadres. This leaves the banks with a dilemma, because if that land was stolen when it was originally occupied by a white family who paid a bond to actually get title to the land, the banks are party to the theft. So they are party to the illegitimate possession of that land according to the ANC government, which basically means the banks themselves have absolutely no hold over the bond, because that bond has been gained illegitimately according to expropriation without compensation. So this huge loss the banks are going to face, because let's face it, if a farmer does have his land taken away and the banks go after him, that's the argument he's going to make. And there's no way the courts can fight it, because that's the whole basis of expropriation. Basis that the banks were party to an illegal theft of land, which means the bond is worthless, or the loan is worthless, that they've gained it illegitimately. Let's continue with this. Banks are caught in the middle of this disaster, and they have no way out. On the one hand, bankers realize that it is unreasonable and unfair to expect borrowers to keep paying bonds if government take away what usually is a lender's biggest capital asset. On the other, banks have a responsibility towards their depositors. Now, let's remember that the whole basis of lending by banks is when people deposit money on fixed deposit, invest through the banking system. These people could be left holding the baby, and it's probably very likely they will. So if you're an investor with large amounts of money invested in a bank and you see expropriation without compensation coming up, this is the time you pull your money out. So it's a chicken and egg situation. There's going to be a huge outflow of capital from the South African banks as well. In the case of a successful farm where the seed of EWC was originally planted, the suddenly unemployed farmer will not have the ability to repay the bond or any other debt associated with his farming business, or to pay his credit card. The farmer will be rendered bankrupt when he still owes the debt intact, but no longer owns the asset. The same goes for any business owner or household, because the current draft legislation to change the Constitution to enable EWC has changed significantly in a few key aspects. Early talks of EWC referred to the redistribution of land with a focus on agricultural land. However, the draft bill now refers to property, which includes any improvements and buildings on a farm. The draft bill also paves the way to effectively wipe off the table the possibility that farmers or anybody else will be able to be compensated for millions of rands worth of improvements and infrastructure on land. The Institute of Race Relation says in an analysis of the draft legislation that the reference to property would also include improvements such as houses, office blocks, shopping centres, factories, hotels, schools and hospitals. EWC will allow government to take away your property and leave South Africa poorer and hungrier, says the Institute of Race Relations. Government is pushing for more power to decide the extent of EWC. Previously, a clause in the draft bill would have let courts decide in which instances EWC would be enacted. The court had to decide in what instance property and any improvement thereon would be expropriated without payment. The Institute of Race Relations says the bill now makes provision for 6 instances in which no compensation is necessary, as well as a new proposal that new instances can be added by way of the new statutes of the bill. Any new statute would only require a simple majority in Parliament to be enacted. The ANC has now further undermined the public participation process by declaring that the draft bill must be amended to give the power to decide on compensation to the executive rather than the courts, according to the Institute of Race Relation analysis. Now, that's really the kicker. So not only do the government, through the vote, change the bill so that any property you own in South Africa can be taken without compensation. They can just come along and knock on your door and say, sorry, this house has been expropriated. Get the hell out of there. And they can do that legally. But not only can they do that, but if you want to claim compensation, the government appoints the committee that assesses whether you should be paid commission or a a return on what was once your property or your investment. So the government are the sole arbitrator, not only on taking your land, but assessing whether you should be compensated at all for that theft. That's how crazy this system is. It is absolutely ridiculous. And the banks are fully aware of the situation, and they are terrified. None of the commercial banks were willing to answer straight questions on what they will do if government takes away properties and owners refuse to pay the outstanding bonds. They were not even willing to discuss the simpler question of the current procedure when dealing with mortgage bond arrears. ABSA ignored any specific questions and responded by way of its media relations department with a short statement saying, "The parliamentary process to amend Section 25 of the Constitution is an ongoing process. We cannot comment at this stage on the matter. We will focus our attention on making our contribution to Parliament when the opportunity arises." Other banks did not answer the questions, referring people to the Banking Association of South Africa, or BASA. Bongani Sibanyoni, head of regulatory advocacy and policy at Nedbank, said that it's currently participating in a process to comment through BASA and other business forums on the draft amendment to the Constitution. Sibanyoni said, "Until there's further clarity on this process, it is business as usual at Nedbank. We continue to assess and grant new mortgage loans as per our usual rules and processes. Bond repayments, which are the subject of a contractual agreement, remain due and payable." BASA promised answers as soon as its executive all had an input. Ironically, BASA's executive committee comprises individual bank executives. A few days passed and no response was received. Nobody can really blame the banks for their reluctance to take a hard stand. Banks get a lot of business from the different levels of government and parastatals. Government use bank accounts, make loans and deposit cash. Government, to a large extent, issue bank licenses and make the rules for banking in South Africa. Government is also the single largest employer in South Africa, and all its employees have bank accounts, hire purchase agreements, and even bonds. Without suggesting that a delay of 1 or 2 days in salary payments to a specific bank might entice employees to move to a friendlier bank, or that such a delay is even possible if a bank gets too critical. First National Bank says that it continues to monitor the development on land reform. It says the bank is actively participating in the ongoing constitutional review process through BASA as part of the broader industry. It went on to say, "The South African government has assured the country that the implementation of land reform will consider the impact on the economy, property rights, and job and food security. Therefore, we remain optimistic that the process will be managed in a responsible manner." Unfortunately, there is no guarantee that the majority of politicians understand basic economic principles and the effect of land grabs on bank and the economy. Reserve Bank figures based on compulsory monthly reports from all registered banks doing business in South Africa showing that the total mortgage bonds amounted to 1,397 billion rand at the end of January. It includes farms and commercial, industrial and residential properties. Commercial banks has to extend another 1 billion rand to the land bank, shown separately in the Reserve Bank figures. If only 5% of the underlying properties are affected by EWC capital to the value of nearly 70 billion rand, simply disappears. After setting a precedent, it can be argued that the total value of all the outstanding bonds reverts to zero. There's absolutely nothing supporting all that money that's been loaned. The effect on individual banks is equally devastating. As an example, First Rand's latest interim results show that the First National Bank has outstanding mortgage bonds of 217 billion rand at the end of June 2019. This compares with First Rand Group's total shareholders' capital of 145 billion rand at the end of June. Note that there are more mortgages in its Rand Merchant Bank division. First Rand has huge assets but also huge liabilities. The same goes for all other banks. The biggest of all bank liabilities is money owed to depositors, as banks are in the business of taking in deposits and lending out the exact same money to borrowers. So the money that people have got invested in the bank right now has been loaned to people with property. How are the banks going to repay those people who've invested their money in the bank by way of fixed deposit or whatever when those loans go bad? They can't. There'll be a run on the bank and the banks will go bankrupt. The walking trail is fairly straight from people refusing or unable to pay mortgages to depositors losing their money. The current system of long-term loans secured by mortgage bonds and property works well, if brutally painful to someone who falls behind their bond repayments. In short, the bank starts legal action to attach the property and sells it to somebody else to recover its depositors' money. The pending EWC legislation might render this procedure obsolete. Courts are mandated to be just and fair, and the contractual obligation in terms of the bond agreement of the original property owner must be considered against the unfairness of expropriation in a court ruling. That's what I was talking about at the start. The banks are party to the alleged theft, according to the ANC government. EWC is bound to leave banks in the middle of the mess. Politicians don't realize that the economy is actually about people, where expectations and confidence shape the future. Some people will hold back a few months before buying a new house or car. A few developers might hold back on planning a new development, and a few farmers might decide to forego the cost of planting a bigger crop or raising more chickens. A foreign firm might delay investment in South Africa. That's the kicker. Who from overseas would even think about investing in South Africa if you've got this expropriation without compensation hanging over your head? Crazy. A little makes a big difference when planning any economic activity, as a difference between a GDP growth of 0.5% per annum and 1.5% illustrates when people reduce their spending and production plans by a mere 1%. To get to the crux of EWC, here are the questions set to banks. 1. If government takes my farm, smallholding house or factory, do I need to keep paying my bond, even if legally obliged? 2. What will the bank do if I stop paying, seeing that I do not own the property anymore? 3. The property is secured for the bond and the bank holds the title deed until the mortgage is paid in full. How does this change when EWC is legislated? 4. What are the steps the bank can take currently when somebody defaults on their bond? 5. Can the bank attach other properties such as my car, another house, or other movable property to settle a debt on the outstanding loan when I refuse to pay when losing my property? 6. What is the total value of the bank's mortgage bond book? 7. If my property is targeted, I'll be tempted to max out my bond to reduce my loss. Maybe even my credit card, overdraft and personal loan, moving the loss to the bank. If my credit score is shot, why would it make a difference? How can the bank prevent it? 8. What is your opinion on the effect of EWC on the financial sector and the economy? So there you go. Look, this whole thing has not been thought through by the ANC government. They're on the take, and being able to just get land free for their cadres is just another form of theft that this ANC government are so incredibly good at. Alright guys, please remember to subscribe to be kept informed, ring the bell for the updates, please like the video, please share the video, and above all, please stay safe.